Michael Hout was born in 1950. He double majored in history and sociology at the University of Pittsburgh, graduating in 1972. He then finished master's and PhD degrees at Indiana University in 1976. He went from there to teach at the University of Arizona for 8 years, and then continued westward to spend nearly 30 years in the sociology department at Berkeley, where he and Fischer became colleagues. Claude Fischer was born to French parents in Paris in 1948. His family moved to New Jersey 4 years later, but eventually moved again to Los Angeles, where he finished high school and then graduated from UCLA with a bachelor's degree in sociology in 1968. After earning his PhD from Harvard in 1972, he returned to California and has been on the faculty at Berkeley ever since. Hout and Fischer have collaborated on several research projects combining their shared interests and special perspectives, including their award-winning book, Centuries of Difference, presenting a wide-ranging view of changing American society over the course of the 20th century. This article is a follow-up to their earlier 2003 article on the same subject, bringing their observations up to date and modifying their earlier conclusions in some ways. With Hout and Fischer's article, we again find ourselves on the first of Chaves' 3 levels of secularization, concentrating on the opinions expressed by individual respondents to national surveys. Also, as in so many other studies, we again find ourselves talking to those respondents interviewed for the general social survey. What would social science do if nobody had ever asked these GSS respondents what they thought about various things? Hout and Fischer rely on one GSS question in particular out of all the many possible choices. This is the foundation stone of religion questions in the survey, the one that asks about your religious preference. The possible answers are Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, a bunch of other write-in candidates that the authors lump all together as other, and the people who say none. We're identifying secularization here, as many scholars do, as the rising tide of the nones, spelled N-O-N-E. Every year or two, the news media get hold of these GSS responses and report another increase in the nones. Hout and Fischer put their share at 20% of the population, and according to this ABC News report from 2017, 3 years after their article was published, the increase continued and the share stood at 21%. Since they have the entire GSS series of survey datasets, Hout and Fischer can go back half a century to the first time this question was asked, back in 1972. Before the last part of the 20th century, before all the sample surveys got started, researchers find a parched desert devoid of public opinion data, so we have a bad habit of assuming that the situation just after mid-century was a kind of normal, stable background, and that all the interesting changes have happened since then. Too bad we don't know any better. The first 20 years or so of this religious preference measure, though, do look pretty stable. The share of nones in the population hovered around 7 or 8% of adults right up through 1990 before things got interesting, which means something was starting to change. But then the new trend set in with a vengeance. Starting in the early 1990s, every year the share of people claiming no religious preference has risen at a steady rate of about half a percentage point per year. Hout and Fischer plot this as a straight line tilting up to the right after 1991 or 1992. If this linear trend continues, before the end of the 21st century, over half the population of the United States would be nones. Clearly, something has changed in these last 30 years, something that many people call secularization. Hout and Fischer, though, deliberately do not use this word in the title of their article. In fact, they explicitly tell us that this trend should not be called secularization. Why not? They explain that they want to reserve the S word for the case where not only are churches losing members, but individual people are also losing interest in religious ideas. This amounts to the distinction often described as being spiritual versus being religious, as in this quote from that icon of modern popular culture, Oprah Winfrey. In this common contrast, spirituality is a private, internal, very personal and subjective condition. Deep down, the spirit within. You can have this feeling in church on Sunday as a good Catholic or Baptist, but you can also feel this way walking alone on the beach in the moonlight, clutching a crystal in your hand. Religion, in contrast to such individualized personal spirituality, only exists when you get together with other members of that religion, agree on shared beliefs, and join in common actions such as worship service. Spirituality is more psychological, religion is more sociological. Once we recognize this important distinction, that you can be spiritual without being religious, Hout and Fischer insist that the S word, secularization, should be reserved only for a situation when both individual spirituality and group religion are in retreat in a population. This definition is by no means universally accepted, but we'll go with it for thinking about their article. Secularization, as they use the word, means that everything that Durkheim would have included in his idea of the sacred is growing weaker, fading, disappearing from society. If the visible social institution we call organized religion were the trunk of a great tree standing in the midst of a forest or other social institutions, then the personal beliefs that Oprah called spirituality might be the roots of that tree. Secularization, like a hurricane, uproots the entire tree and knocks it to the ground. In order for Hout and Fischer to call that trend in their first chart secularization, they would need to show not only fewer people belonging to religious groups, but fewer people believing spiritual ideas. We're going to take their various charts and related discussion of these issues a little out of the order they present them in the article, because this fundamental issue of whether the trend is secularization or not requires that we start first with their chart showing trends in what people believe. This chart shows a very different picture from the first one, with its steady expansion of the no religion respondents. They consider half a dozen different possible GSS questions about personal beliefs. Some of them, like whether you believe in life after death, have been asked every year right along with the religious preference question, while others were added more recently or have been asked only in certain years. But no matter which question we look at, if you tally up the share of people who believe each of these things in different years, there's no important visible change in any of these beliefs over the past 30 or even 50 years. The lines for all the questions in this chart are basically flat and horizontal. That would be fine from 1970 to 1990, when nothing was happening to that religious preference measure either. But if the trend in that measure since 1990 deserved the label secularization, then these various belief questions should have slanted downward after 1990. The beliefs should have faded away as the people started going to brunch instead of to church on Sundays. It turns out that the personal beliefs, the roots of our tree, are still planted firmly in the ground. The big increase in people who say they have no religious preference comes among people who still believe things like there's life after death, God is real, and so on. Hout and Fischer suggest that we call these people unchurched believers. So the trend in their first chart should not be called secularization then. The sacred tree has not been uprooted by some kind of social or cultural hurricane. Instead, we have to conclude that somebody came along and sawed off the religious tree, leaving the spiritual stump still standing in the ground of American society. This leaves us with a new and puzzling question. Who were those lumberjacks, and how did they manage it? Faced with the new mystery of who sawed off the tree of organized religion and left behind a stump of individualized spirituality in the American forest, Hout and Fischer almost automatically turn to the standard toolkit of the social science detective. They try to narrow down the list of suspects. Ever since John Stuart Mill came up with the idea, social scientists have pursued what we call the method of differences. Since we can't actually seize an entire human population and subject them to experimental conditions that allow us to control every aspect of their lives, we have to break down that population into identifiable groups and then compare our outcome of interest as it appears in each group. For example, if we find more retreat from organized religion in one group than in another, just maybe we can explain that religious difference by connecting it to whatever else is different about these groups. If we find that no matter how we slice the social pie, the retreat from religion that showed up after 1990 in that first chart in the article shows up again and again in exactly the same way in every group we look at, we're sunk. We haven't found any answers using the method of differences. But Hout and Fischer give it the old college try. Their first idea for explaining a trend that suddenly shows up in 1990 and then continues at a steady rate of increase for 30 years is the same idea that often turns out to explain a lot of what is going on in any society in any respect. They are not disappointed either, because this idea turns into the most powerful, important part of their explanation. We might call this the demographic metabolism explanation. They call it generational succession. The idea is really very simple. Societies may go on and on forever. The Chinese describe society as a rope that reaches back infinitely far into the past and stretches out infinitely far in front of us into the future. But if you look closely at any rope, you find that it is woven and twisted together out of millions or billions of individual fibers, and each fiber has a beginning and an end. We are those fibers. We're born, we die, and the society goes on around us. It was there before we were born, and it will go on after we're gone. For convenience, we often try to assign historical markers separating sections of this rope into generations, like the greatest generation that fought in our best war ever, the Second World War, or the enormous baby boom generation born between 1946 and 1964, or the millennials born during the 1980s and 1990s, and so on. Just suppose that each of these generations acquired a permanent religious stamp in childhood, a stamp that lasted for the rest of their collective lives. Now suppose that the older, earlier generations were stamped with a bigger religious stamp, while for the younger, newer generations, the ink in the stamp pad was drying out and the arms doing the stamping were getting tired, so the religious stamp gets fainter for each new generation. Finally, imagine that the demographic metabolism of society continually eliminates the older generations as time goes on and replaces them with the newer ones. What will happen in a chart like the first one shown to us by Hout and Fischer? If this generational succession idea were the whole story, then the no religion percentage would chart as a perfectly flat line over time for every generation, showing how strongly it had been stamped in childhood. The only change in such a chart would be that each of these horizontal lines for generations would be stacked above each other, with permanently weaker religious identities in each new generation. As the religious older generations died out, the less religious new generations would tilt the average for the total population upward at a steady rate. So Hout and Fischer apply the method of differences to 10-year birth cohorts of people, and sure enough, these lines are a lot flatter than the original chart. Also, as predicted, the oldest birth cohorts have the fewest no-religion people, and the youngest birth cohorts have much higher levels of no religion. This difference between generations helps us to isolate the retreat from organized religion in some groups more than in others. But the picture is not completely satisfying because these lines are not perfectly flat. There's still something else going on here, and again it starts during the 1990s, after 20 previous years of nothing happening. We won't go into that mysterious something yet, but one thing you definitely should keep in mind is that the inflection point where these lines suddenly change course and start to tip slightly upward comes in the early 1990s for all the different cohorts. This means that whatever it was, it had nothing to do with how old each group was at the time, because they were all at different ages in the early 1990s. It was something specific to that time period, not to one particular cohort or generation. However, the largest part of the story does turn out to be the difference between these generations. We see this not in that tipping up of the lines, but from the simple fact that the lines are stacked so far apart above and below each other in the chart. The older generations, despite having some slight upward tipping after 1990, never get close to the level of no religion that we observe for the younger generations from the earliest years we can observe them. Most of the difference in no religion appears between these generations, not within them. Hout and Fischer refine this picture by explaining two separate components of how a generation ends up less religious than an earlier generation that came before it. To do this, they consult another of the GSS questions that asks about the religious situation in your parental family when you were still a child living with them. Were you in a religion then or not? They compare this answer to what you say later as an adult about being in a religion or not. Most people reported living in religious households when they were young, so whatever happens to these respondents would be the main part of the story. Despite their religious beginnings, some of these people decided to say no religion as adults. This loss of childhood religion was quite rare for the older cohorts. Only 4% of people born in the 1930s lost a childhood religion. But over 20% of those born in the 1980s turned away from organized religion as they got older. This is a clear generational contrast in the staying power of childhood religious socialization. The other side of this childhood coin involves the minority of respondents who grew up outside of organized religion. Hout and Fischer are mildly surprised to report that in the older generations, even most of these people eventually acquired a religious preference as adults. Only a quarter of the people born in the 30s who grew up without religion stayed outside religion as adults. On the other hand, adult conversions into religion were much rarer among the younger cohorts. If they started life outside religion, they almost all stayed outside later as well. So Hout and Fischer have used a method of differences to compare different birth cohorts or generations successfully, to focus attention on the fact that each new generation has become much less connected to organized religion than were earlier cohorts. One discordant note in this tune, however, is that such generational contrast did not produce any rising trend of no religion for American society before 1990. Cohorts most prominent in those days were much more alike. The generational contrasts have emerged since 1990. Why? Or again, the no religion responses suddenly tilt upward after 1990, even within each generation, although not as steeply as for the population average. Again, why the tipping point after 1990? We have an answer to where the no religion responses have emerged in terms of different birth cohorts, but we still don't have the why. After they discover that the retreat from organized religion concentrates particularly among younger, newer generations, Hout and Fischer still have to admit that answering this who question does not really answer the why question. People born in different decades all have the same number of eyes and ears. The main difference must be in what they were seeing and hearing. So Hout and Fischer turn to look at things from a different angle, this time considering the political views expressed by GSS respondents. Here again, we see the very clear inflection point at about 1990 in this chart. After that time, the no religion responses take off and climb very steeply for the most liberal respondents in each year's survey. Although the slightly liberal and moderate respondent groups start out from lower, stable levels at the 1990 starting point, in fact, the upward slope in no religion is just about equally steep for all these groups. On the other hand, there's no sign of any such inflection point for conservatives, and for people who say they're slightly conservative, the upward trend in no religion is much more modest. Hout and Fischer conclude the obvious from this. What they describe repeatedly as political polarization within American society can be traced back roughly to a 1990 launch point. Since that time, religious organizations, along with nearly all other institutional features of American life, have been turned into political battlegrounds. Not just red states and blue states, but families, churches, businesses, and everything else you can think of. This is not the place for a deeper examination of that trend. You need a whole separate course for that. But Hout and Fischer think that the consequences for religion were clear. When political conflict and polarization extended its reach inside religious congregations, the liberals tended to quit and run away, leaving the religious organizations in the hands of their conservative opponents. This raises a fascinating question that Hout and Fischer never ask, but we ought to. Remember Rodney Stark and his theory of the religious marketplace? If millions of liberals were bailing out of their old religious congregations, Why didn't the dynamic entrepreneurial American spirit bring forth a generation of new religious entrepreneurs to generate new congregations and denominations in which the runaway liberals would feel comfortable? There are liberal Christians out there advising us to love our neighbors, feed the hungry, clothe the naked, and so on, but somehow we just aren't seeing the blue side of the population finding its way back into churches. Is there something inherent in being a liberal that makes it harder to stay connected to organized religion? Something inherent in being a conservative that makes this easier to do? Hout and Fischer get a hunch that maybe something like this could be true, and they decide to look at some other attitude questions that test this idea. The first of these they describe as attitudes toward authority. Along this dimension, they see attitudes ranging from obey authority on one hand to think for yourself on the other. They chart a clear trend in American society over time, accelerating particularly in the second half of the 20th century, putting more emphasis on the think for yourself side of this balance. The phrase was even the title of a song by the Beatles, and they're already ancient music history. It's pretty easy to see why such a shift towards more personal autonomy could undermine religious authority. If we find out that political liberals also shift away from obey authority towards think for yourself, that would help to explain why it was they, rather than the political conservatives, who abandoned the church pews over the last 30 years. The other attitudes that Hout and Fischer think go along with the religious retreat of the liberals concern new behavioral norms. In particular, they single out things like acceptance of alternative sexual identities and preferences, issues of reproduction and contraception, and other societal currents that clearly go against some of the core doctrines found in traditional religious organizations. From the Roman Catholics to the Southern Baptists, it's hard to find church congregations where these new behavioral norms and values find a comfortable home. Here again, though, the ghost of Rodney Stark should be looking over the shoulders of Hout and Fischer, asking why we don't see more new congregations and denominations springing up around these new norms. This actually might be a case of Chaves' societal level of secularization rather than the individual level. It's easy to find liberals who don't want to listen to religious authority figures preaching that same-sex marriage is a sin, but it's just as easy to find conservatives who don't want scientific authority figures telling them to wear face masks against a pandemic. If the institution of organized religion in society becomes just one among many plural sources of values for what we should be doing, we may be creating our own American version of the pillarization observed in the Netherlands, with one of the pillars here being religion in general. The new group identities that entrepreneurs are creating for the liberals may be out there, but they just are not religious identities. If there are any such emerging liberal pillars, though, so far they don't have many equivalents to local congregations where they can get together, mobilize, and support each other. This may put them at a large political disadvantage if such local groups remain important in the virtual internet age. Hout and Fischer conclude, after some statistical magic that can take your breath away and that only the high priests of social science can follow, that these new attitudes are closely tied to GSS respondents who express the no religion preference. This figure 6 from their article is a little tricky. It has lines on it for 3 attitudes. The black line at the bottom is for not believing in God or the Bible. This would be a pure secularization explanation. The green line in the middle is for what they call countercultural beliefs, like tolerating marijuana, premarital sex, birth control, or same-sex marriages. The red line at the top is preferring the think for yourself option instead of obey authority. But these lines do not show how many people agreed with these positions. They only show whether these attitudes predict that you also quit religion. For people born 100 years ago, the few people outside religion were there mainly because they didn't like the obey authority rule. The other 2 were not important. In fact, the reject God reason has never been an important explanation for being no religion. The think for yourself reason got more and more important until the baby boom generation came along, but since then it has just continued to be important for everybody not in church. And through the whole 20th century, the link between countercultural attitudes and leaving church has gotten stronger and stronger all the time. But the bottom line for Hout and Fischer is not just that the younger, more liberal counterculture people in American society are abandoning organized religion. On their final page, they ask whether the belief questions may also fade if people are not part of some group that teaches those beliefs. Can you be spiritual if neither you nor your parents nor anybody else around you in your pillar of American society is religious? This is a question that you'll have to wait to answer when you can examine another general survey another 20 or 30 years from now.